Hi, welcome back. So this next video is going to be focusing on the structure of the synovial joint. So hopefully you just watched the video on the classifications. We ended with diarthrotic joints, which are synovial. So diarthrotic is our freely movable functional classification, and synovial is our structural classification. So synovial joints are special in that they have key characteristics. So I'm going to just outline those in the next video, and I'll talk about a condition that might be associated with some synovial joints. So on the left, I'm going to start with just a typical synovial joint, not an actual example. If it was anything, it looks like it might be your interphalangeal joints between this bone and this bone, but it's just a generalized synovial joint. So it's listed here, the four things that all synovial joints are going to have is one, they have a joint capsule. So a joint capsule connects the two articulating bones together. So if you'll notice, the connective tissue of a joint capsule, which is usually dense, irregular connective tissue, blends in to the periosteum on either side, right, of the articulating bones. So it's very tightly connected. Those collagen fibers of the periosteum blend with the collagen fibers of the joint capsule. Okay, so that's one. The inner lining of the joint capsule is called the synovial membrane. So at the end of chapter 4, you learned about your different membranes, right? So we had cutaneous, mucose, serous, and synovial. So this is where we're seeing those synovial joints come back. It is an incomplete membrane. It's not a true membrane like we see, say, like with the cutaneous membrane. So it has some kind of scattered epithelial cells that secrete fluid, which is filling up this third characteristic I'll take a look at, is a joint cavity. So there's space. There's actual physical space between the two articulating joints that's filled with the fluid that is secreted by the synovial membrane. And then lastly, on the ends, on the opposing ends of your articulating bones, we have what's called articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is of the type hyaline. So if you remember from tissues, we learned the three types of cartilage: elastic, hyaline, and fibrocartilage. This is hyaline cartilage that is found at these articulating surfaces. So we just call it articular cartilage, but it is hyaline in structure. So the functions of some of these things, right? So the joint capsule holds the bones together. It kind of also contains the fluid. The synovial membrane secretes the fluid and helps to recycle kind of just the circulation of this fluid. And it helps to lubricate, right? So the fluid helps to lubricate and reduce friction. And then the main job of reducing friction and compression resistance is the cartilage. So it's nice and smooth. It's got that nice smooth matrix. And so those surfaces are not going to be bone on bone. It's going to have the liquid, and it's going to have the cartilage in there, making the movement nice and smooth. So those are the four components of a synovial joint: capsule, lined by a membrane, articular cartilage, and a space filled with fluid. So those are the four things all synovial joints are going to have. Now on the other side of this picture, this is a specific synovial joint of the knee. And we're going to take a closer look at the knee with some of its details, but I wanted to point out the four key features here, but also highlight some additional structures that you might see in a synovial joint. So let's find our four things. So one, here's our joint capsule, okay? Two, we can see that is lined by the synovial membrane. Three, here's our joint cavity filled with the fluid. And then lastly, four, here's our articular cartilage. So yes, it checks all of those boxes for having the four components needed for a synovial joint, but there's a whole bunch of other things. So what are these other things? Well, sometimes we can have accessory ligaments. If they're inside the capsule, they're called intracapsular, intra meaning inside. If they're outside and supporting outside of the capsule, they're called extracapsular ligaments. And we'll see all the names of these when we get to the actual knee details. Other things that we might see are accessory cartilage pads that are not the articular cartilage, but accessory pads that actually are not attached to the bone. And in the knee, these are called meniscus, and they are made up of fibrocartilage. So they have a different makeup than the hyaline cartilage. You might see some fat pads just adipose tissue helping to pad things. You can actually feel your your patellar fat pad if you like straighten your leg. So your patella gets nice and loose, your kneecap gets nice and loose, and then just below that, you'll feel all the squishy stuff behind. That's your fat pad, just sitting behind your patella, kind of a little bit inferior to it. And then the last thing that we can see associated with some of our synovial joints are what are called bursa. And there's quite a few. So they've shown one here. There's a couple down here. There's another bursa up here. So what are bursa? So bursa are little sacs, almost I like to think of them as like a water balloon. So they're like little sacs of synovial membrane filled with synovial fluid. Their job is to reduce friction, and they're usually found between two different types of tissues. So for example, here we have bone on one side and skin and fat on the other. So the bursa acts as like a buffer, so the skin and fat does not rub up directly against the bone. Here, in these ones down here towards the bottom, we have bone between ligament, and we have ligament between skin and fat. So bursa are the friction reducers. Now, if you work your joint a lot, that friction can actually inflame the bursa and give you what's called bursitis. This next slide is an example of how sometimes you can overwork your joints and get this inflammation of your bursa. So on the left hand, we see all of the bursa that can be found in the knee. And here is an unfortunate individual who, oops, that's not a very bright color. Here we go. Who unfortunately has a swollen pre-patellar bursa that's sitting on the anterior surface of the bursa, and that's really swollen. It's just the inflammation, right? We learned inflammation at the end of chapter 4. Blood vessels get leaky, things get swollen, you get a lot of fluid kind of leaking out of your blood vessels, and so there you have a bursa, bursitis. So here's one of the elbow olecranon bursa. This guy over here is more than just bursa. If you'll notice, it's really red, it's probably really warm. So my guess is that individual is dealing with an infected bursa. So not only was it inflamed, it probably was inflamed at first, but then maybe there was a tear or a break in the tissue that allowed some kind of pathogen in there, and now there's a bacterial infection going on inside of that inflamed bursa. Does not look fun, and it looks quite painful. So anytime you have bursa between two different kind of textures of tissues, usually a harder and a softer one, if you have too much friction over that area, then you could get inflamed bursa, and it can be pretty painful. So a lot of times you have repetitive injury, bursitis going along with repetitive movements or repetitive injuries, like pitchers or tennis players or house cleaners, these types of things that are always compressing or rubbing or having friction associated with their bursa. Okay. That is the structure of our synovial joints. The next video we're going to take a look at is all different kinds of body movements that can take place around your articulations. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.